Antu, do you want to go ahead and introduce Dr. Plummer?
Sounds good. Okay, looks like everyone's also trickling in. So welcome everyone, happy Monday. So today's speaker that we're really honored to have is Dr. Plummer. She's the CEO of the Onyx therapy group, whose mission is centered around addressing mental health issues and disparities, inequalities in communities and organizations and individuals in need. She has extensive experience in working with Black women, same-sex couples, the LGBTQ community, and ties in her experiences from the military, school, community leadership, university faculty, and parenting as a consultant. She also has a lot of extensive experiences, not just in clinical, but also she's a faculty at Johns Hopkins, and she's a consultant in various kind of clinical settings as well. So we're very, very happy that she's here to share her expertise with us. Dr. Plummer, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our program this morning.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna have to add you onto my marketing team. You make me sound so good reading that. I was like, oh, I do all of that. I do. I guess I do. So thank you so much, Kantu, and thank you so much to the leadership there at George Washington University and inviting me. One of the ways that we got connected, and I hope that I get to connect with some of you all as students also, is that we are going to be serving in the future as one of your externship sites, Onyx Therapy Group. So being able to work a lot more closely with you all as well. But nonetheless, thank you for that introduction, Kantu, and for bringing me here today. Like you all heard, my name is Dr. Linnell Plummer, and I am indeed the CEO of Onyx Therapy Group. We are based out of Washington, D.C. However, we have 9 offices in 4 states centered around providing therapy to everyone, including with a focus on marginalized communities. So folks who have not necessarily seen themselves in the world in all the positive ways and needing to have navigation and support around that, are also people who are looking to unlearn certain elements of socialization that have been presented to them that's not currently working in their life. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm also faculty at Johns Hopkins University. I've been there for a couple of years, and I teach in the clinical mental health program with a large focus around counseling adolescents, counseling children, as well as a course that I started called entrepreneurship, so that I'm going to be able to bring some of that forward with you guys today in terms of what it means to be an entrepreneur as a mental health person, and what it also means in terms of my specialties, which are providing counseling support, again, to marginalized communities. My focus has been on women and intersections, so race and gender intersections, as well as same-sex couples. I identify as a member of the LGBTQ community and recognize that sometimes I have a bit of a passing privilege. People don't necessarily look at me and think that I'm part of the community and what that means as well. So I get to bring all of that forward. If you can't tell by some of my corny jokes so far, I am an extrovert, and so I really want to come forward with you all and have a conversation. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint because I feel like I didn't want to engage in the typical lecture kind of experience today. Instead, I wanted you all to have access to all of the knowledge that I have in the ways that you want to get that information. So by asking questions that stand out for you. I'm going to be monitoring the chat, but again, I do love to hear people's voices as well. So you can unmute yourself at any point. I will not perceive it as rude. I actually will be very thrilled to hear from you as you're asking questions. There's no question that is off mark. So anybody can ask any question and I will answer the question, because I do believe that's part of the learning experience. So feel free to do that as we move forward. So your chat, unmuting yourself, and all that great stuff as well. So I'm going to start a little bit about I'm going to talk about my experiences in 2 different formats. So one is going to be the entrepreneurship piece, and then the other is going to be working with marginalized communities. Quick question. How many of you all want to own a business after graduation? Okay, well then you know what? Let's pivot. We don't need to talk about the entrepreneurship then, right? Because that might not be so helpful. Let's instead talk about what my experiences have been. How many of you all want to practice in the mental health field afterwards? Like you see yourself working with a client? Working with a client? Okay. What are some of the other things that you guys are interested in doing? So I could, a quick needs assessment so I can make sure that I'm meeting you where you are. So tell me some other things that you guys are interested in.
Well, I'm interested in mental health disparities and like stigma in the African American community and how stigma serves as a barrier to like help seeking behaviors. So I guess I was just wondering, like, as like the CEO of your own business and as a Black woman who identifies in the LGBTQ community, what's been some of your biggest obstacles in like your path?
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna, Alana, right?
Yes, Alana, thank you.
Right, perfect. I'm gonna get to that in a second. Let me hear from a couple more students about what they want to do in their future, and then I'll come right back to your question and be able to answer it for you. So others, what are some other things that you want to do in the future?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Good morning, David.
Morning, nice to meet you. I'm thinking of going in academia and doing research. I'm much more interested on that side right now, but we'll see.
Okay, perfect, perfect. I have some things I could add in there as well. So thank you for sharing, David. Let me hear from one more person maybe.
I think for me, it will be like an intersection between research and the implementation of different interventions in the community. So a lot of involvement in like directly implementing evidence-based interventions for communities who need, especially for prenatal mothers from marginalized communities. Particularly for me, I really want to be involved in global mental health, but yeah, it's just there.
All right, perfect. A person you could also reach out to who would be a great resource with that subcategory of maternal mental health would be Acoma Counseling, AKOMA. She's based in DC also, and she is really active in maternal mental health. So thank you for sharing that also, Kantu. Let me go back to Alana's question. And again, at any point, if you have any questions, feel free to answer or feel free to ask them. So I guess there's a long story that comes with that, Alana. I am also so your question was around stigma and obstacles in providing mental health services, specifically to those who don't necessarily see it that way, right? They have stigmas associated with it. So so in my history, in my past, I became interested in mental health because I grew up in a very marginalized community. I grew up in poverty in Los Angeles, California, and I saw all of what I now consider to be mental health issues. I saw it as a child, but didn't know what to call it. I just knew something was off. Like something doesn't seem right here. You know, how are people making these particular decisions over these decisions? Some of these decisions are not aligning with what I see on TV or the books that I'm reading. Like, where's the disconnect? And so that's how I got interested in understanding that there's actually disconnects, right? Like people are actually disconnected from what is happening for a number of reasons, whether it's related to poverty or whether it's related to social systems that are not as supportive as they're designed to be, or whatever the case may be. So I knew early on that there were things that were different in these marginalized communities, but didn't know what to call it. But that's how I became interested in psychology, because I wanted to understand how people made decisions and what influences were a part of their decisions. So as such, my theoretical orientation is cognitive because I am always interested in the thought process, right? But this intersection with how it works with the environment as well. So as I grew up, I joined the Army. So I am also a veteran. So shout out to all the veterans. If you know veterans, remember Veterans Day is in just a couple of days. So make sure to give them some extra love. And so then I was a part of the military, and that's where I really saw the system differences around marginalization, right? Like how some people were kind of ostracized here based off of whatever the standards or situations were. So when I decided that I wanted to start practicing counseling, I also wanted to focus on those stigmas. I wanted to focus on the disenfranchised communities. One of the things that I did in going in there is that I was not super clinical in my approach to counseling because I realized that that was turning people off. So I didn't have like a couch in my space. I didn't have like all of this counselor related stuff on my walls because I wanted it to feel more like a conversation with people, because that's what counseling is, right? It's a conversation. We as mental health folks know a little bit more of the theoretical side, we know more of the technical side, but it's really a conversation with two people. And I wanted them to feel like that as well. I think the perception of mental health outside of our field of work is that it's cold, right? It's a very Freudian perspective in that it's cold, the person is objective, it's isolating, that there's not a lot of understanding or relatability or even self-disclosure. So one of my approaches and my consistent approach now in working with folks that are in marginalized communities and they're like, I don't want to do therapy. I don't want anybody judging me. I don't want this and that. I said, well, you have conversations with your friends, right? Like you have conversations with your family. You're essentially having a conversation with me. I have a little bit of information that I could add in to help, right? Your family and friends are giving you advice based off of their experiences. And I ask you questions based off of, what I know about certain things. And it just becomes a conversation. And so many of my clients and the clients that are in Onyx view therapy as that way because that's how we market it. And that's how we continue to engage with people. And because I'm an extrovert and my leadership are also very engaging kind of people, when they meet us, they're already attracted to our energy and subsequently want to just continue to have conversations. And before you know it, they're making all these cognitive shifts and these behavioral changes, and they didn't even realize that they were actually doing all of that stuff because for them, it was just a conversation. And it became a series of conversations. And we continue to have those series, of conversations. So that was one of the ways I addressed it directly with clients. When I also will disclose a little bit more than what I have been taught in school to disclose, because no one wants to share all of their personal experiences and don't know anything about you. That doesn't feel like reciprocity. It doesn't feel like connection. It doesn't feel like community, right? And because I see myself as a healer of my community or within my community, I want them to feel connected to me in those ways too. So I'll share with myself, just like I did with you all a few minutes ago. I identify and being part of the LGBTQ community. I'm a mom, I do this, I do that, things that they can like hold on to and say, I have some commonality there. And whenever they ask me a question, similar to how I set it up with you all, there's no question for me that's offline. However, everybody has to be comfortable with that for themselves, right? You all have to be comfortable with whatever questions you decide to answer. And I'm comfortable having it open like that for myself. And I find that actually keeps my clients a lot more engaged. And it's also how I encourage my clinicians to be as well. We have 21 clinicians on staff, and that's how I encourage them to interact as well. And we find that we have a lot of sustainability because of that. Our wait list right now is at like 187 people because our reputation has been strong in that people want that kind of connection. They want that kind of familial experience where you can relate to your counselor. It's not just that the counselor knows it all. They may have had some pitfalls in their life as well. And if asked, they would be willing to share elements of that too. Those are on the clinical personal lens, Alana. On the larger lens, in terms of how I address stigma in panels that I speak on, or when I'm doing something related to media, or even when I'm teaching my students, I address it in a very similar fashion in that, mental health is as important as physical health. In fact, from my position, mental health might be even more important because you can't always address some of the physical health issues if you're not mentally present or mentally there. So I do talk a lot about things that people can relate to. So I talk about how food and nutrition impacts mental health, or how physical activity or relationships impact mental health. And when somebody is able to grab onto the information, they become a little bit more interested in wanting to have another conversation afterwards. And that's how we kind of get them started in terms of understanding that counseling is a conversation, it's a relationship, it's our mental health rather is a relationship. And so it doesn't have to be stigmatized because we have conversations with people all the time. You just happen to be having a conversation with me, you know, which is a little bit different. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome. And then David, I think you had a question around academia and research in terms of being a professor. There are some differences in being a researcher and in academia versus being a clinician. Clinicians get a lot of their information and the determination of the interventions that they use because researchers have done a lot of the research already, right? So they've been out there studying and collecting the data and things like that. The intersection is one that you have to make for your own self. Being in academia can be very time consuming because you're teaching, right? So you have to read all the textbooks that your students are reading. I know you all think that your professors are not reading your books, but we're reading the same books and we're writing in the margins and we're highlighting and all of that kind of stuff too. So we're reading the books, we're reading the articles, we have to make the lesson plans, as well as the PowerPoints and grading the assignments, as well as attending all of the meetings that we have to attend. So there's a large part of that that is directly related to students. Then there's the research part of it. So in academia, depending on what kind of contract you have, you may have a contract where you teach a few less classes, but you have to produce a little bit more in your research, right? So you have to maybe produce an article or 2 articles every year or something like that, or you have to be working on a book and there's evidence of that. And so you're reducing your course load a little bit. When one is trying to do all 3, it's a little bit more challenging because you have to be intentional about where you want your time to be. So if you have to teach 4 classes a semester and produce an article and you want to still see clients, what you have to do is lay out your schedule tightly. So for me, I see clients 1 or 2 days a week, and I teach 1 day a week. So I put all of my classes on one day. And I do preparation on another day. So that's 4 days out the week that I'm doing that kind of work. Because I'm the CEO at this point, I weave in my time for owning the company because my leadership team is very solid. So I have a full operating leadership team with like directors and chiefs and things like that. So I'm able to still teach and see clients, but I honestly am reducing my caseload so that I could spend a little bit more time in business development. So it could be done, David. You just have to figure out what you want your entryway to be. Do you want to enter into your career first in academia, or do you want to enter into it first as a clinician? And then you're going to use those experiences as leverage for the other element. So if you enter first in academia and then decide you want to do clinical work, when you start marketing yourself, you're going to market yourself as a researcher with application to, because you have additional knowledge of, and that's how you would market yourself to get your clients. If you are entering as a clinician first and then going into academia, you would then market yourself as a clinician who has concrete data around what's happening in the field, because researchers are not always connected to the field. They're connected to their data population, but not necessarily the consistency of what's happening in the field. And so you would market yourself to the university that you're applying for through that particular lens. It can be done, but you have to have a very clear schedule. The other thing with academia is that nobody tells you what your schedule is. They tell you when to show up for class, right? Like you pick your classes and you got to show up for your class time. But in terms of all of your planning and preparation, that's very fluid. And so you have to be very organized when you come into academia. Otherwise, a lot of things will fall through the cracks. So for me, my schedule is very much connected to my day-to-day experience. Did that answer your question, David?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And then later I could come back in terms of talking about research interest, if that's something that you want to discuss as well. And then we had another question from Cantu around the intersection. I think I answered that a little bit, the intersection between research and clinical elements. In terms of maternal mental health, it's a beautiful subset of mental health that is coming out, and I'm glad that folks are finally making moves around that and awareness around that, because that used to just fall under traditional mental health services and not necessarily the subset of maternal mental health, which is largely focused on the hormonal changes and the socialization element and grief and loss that comes with being a mother or a parent in general, because although you get to bring forth life, if that's what has been chosen for you, you don't always acknowledge what you are losing in doing that, right? Like losing your social network sometimes, or losing certain freedoms. And so the maternal mental health allows for so many intersections to be acknowledged, but it's best to be trained from a person who has been doing that work as well. So you get your general education from the university and your internships, but if you want a specialty like that, it's best to be getting that information from somebody who's in the field and doing it, because there's so many things that you have to consider, like even phrases that you kind of avoid because they may trigger certain clients, or the carefulness around helping them navigate what their social media looks like, which could be constant reminders of loss and things like that as well. So again, Cantu, you could reach out to Acoma Counseling, but I can also connect you with a couple other organizations like the Womenhood Coalition, who are focused on similar elements of maternal mental health, specifically in marginalized communities. So particularly in communities that are Black and Brown, because the mortality rates, the infant mortality rates are higher, and the mother's mortality rate is higher as well. So there's general content informations and associations, and then there's even smaller groups amongst them to go deeper into the content as well. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. What other questions may you all have? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about working. I highlighted for just a few minutes about working with marginalized communities. I'll go a little bit deeper into the two communities that I spend the most time with, one being Black women and the other being members of the LGBTQ community. And so in working with Black women, that's actually what my dissertation was on. It was the intersection between race and gender in supervising Black women. And it extended it because many of the women, my criteria was Black women, but many of the women were not necessarily Black American. And so then there are the other cultural elements in terms of if they were Black from the Caribbean, or Black from Europe, or Black from the continent of Africa, if they were Black from Asia, right? Like, because Black people are everywhere, and subsequently they have their own experiences that relate to that. So one sees the skin color and they see the gender, or what they represent as gender, but not necessarily the cultural pieces behind it. So some of the things that came out for that was, when people are constantly being marginalized in communities, they need to have a safe space where they feel like they can be heard 100%, that what they say, people are not going to try to negate. So one of the things that came out from that was to be a cognitive therapist working with Black communities means that you have to be extremely careful, because as cognitive therapists, we are addressing distortions, but unless you've lived certain experiences, what you may be hearing may actually be a distortion, or it may not be a distortion. It may actually be a representation of what they have consistently experienced. In working with women in particular, one of the things that keeps coming up is this need to be heard, because in their work environments, they're being pushed to the side, or people are over talking them, or people are taking their ideas and calling it their own. Then there's from the feminist perspective, there's this interesting intersection between power and voice that we sometimes accidentally take away from people. We're never intentionally taking away somebody's voice, but even small things like interrupting them when they're speaking can make one feel like their voice has been taken away and they're not being heard. So it was some of the kind of strategies that came out of that was making sure we're never interrupting a Black woman when she's speaking. You know, asking just a certain number of questions and limited it really at about 3 questions in a small segment, because more than that kind of feels like interrogation, right? Which is something that many people have had early experiences with, because they were people were trying to either understand them or they were trying to take away what they were thinking, right? Like making them think that their thoughts were inappropriate or opposite. And so again, you know, being careful with the kind of questions that we're asking and when we're asking them, given this familial kind of experience. So coming in and you know, asking about light things before getting too heavy with it, right? So what are you feeling about the election results? You know, if you were this kind of supporter, how did you celebrate? If you were this kind of supporter, how have you processed your grief, right? Like, so being able to like be a little light around it before we get very deep into certain elements. And also being very organized, because that shows the idea of the consideration around planning, right? Like you've planned for me to be here with you. You've taken me seriously, and this is not some kind of whimsical experience. So those are just a few of the tips. I have the dissertation outline and the visual that I can give to you all. If you reach out to me by email, I can send that to you all if you guys are interested in working with Black women. There were 33 strategies that came out of that research that I've been applying into my work, my clients and my supervisees, and it's been wonderful. And my supervisees and counselors in my practice also use those strategies with their clients, and we're seeing a lot of growth. Again, 187 people on our wait list today. So we know that the strategies are working well and that they're spreading that content and information to their friends as well. Any questions about that? Or what are your thoughts, rather?
I have a question. Thank you, Dr. Plummer. Yes, I was wondering if you were also integrating some of that research into your clinical practice and how that works.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah, I absolutely put it into my clinical practice. I stopped getting new clients maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So the clients that are with me are clients that have been with me for a number of years now. And I did that because, again, I wanted to start focusing on business development a little bit more, and it takes time to build relationships with clients. But the clients that I currently work with, I absolutely use it. And when I do, I tell them what I am doing, right? Because I think that knowledge is important as well, especially when clients are coming in and they're trying to break cycles. Because we know that there's transference in the clinical setting, I have to be aware of whatever I'm doing is also serving as a role model for them too. And so when I'm doing something different, then I say, hey, in this moment, this is the strategy that I'm using. What did it feel like for me to use this strategy with you? Is this a strategy that you would want to use with your family? How can we make this clinical experience something that's a little bit more personal that you could use at work, or that you could use with your spouse, or you could use with your children? So I definitely use it. My clients are super committed and loyal, so I think that many of them have at least browsed my dissertation, so they know they found a way to find it, and then they come in and they talk to me about it. You know, I read such and such. What does this methodological approach mean? I was like, what? Why are we talking about that? Why are we not talking about what happened to you when you were 7 years old? But that's what they want to talk about instead. And because there's no question that's offline, I answer the questions, right? So to answer your question, I guess that's my long answer to your short question, Mimi. But yes, I use it in my clinical practice. And not only do I use it, I talk about it in detail so that they can recreate the experiences for themselves as well, because I understand parallel processing, and that what happens in the clinical setting can be recreated in their personal lives as well. So I outline it for them too. Yeah. And any other thoughts? Thank you, Mimi. Do you see how casual I am? I didn't bring a PowerPoint. There is no checks for understanding. There's no quiz at the end of this. It's just me and you talking. Oh, okay. Oh, are you speaking to us, Miss Moloch?
Yep, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about do you engage, your company does it engage in outreach to the LGBT community in particular? I think historically that community has felt misaligned and demonized and denigrated by mental health. So are there things that you all do in particular that attract that community to your work?
Absolutely. And I could go, I'm gonna talk about that as well. I saw that as well. Thank you, Alana. So yes, so let me back up a little bit. When I knew as a young girl, I do a lot of presentations around mental health and the LGBTQ community. And I really started doing them in the last maybe 5 years. I knew when I was about 7 years old that there was something a little different with me, right? I grew up in the 80s. I just turned 40 in September. But it wasn't always safe to say that, right? So when everybody is singing their little crush songs, you know, everybody got the little songs that they like and they're singing those songs. And I'm not quite thinking about the fellas when I'm singing the song, right? I'm thinking about the ladies. But I can't say that, right? Because that's going to cause some issues. So I went ahead and I lived a life that is considered traditional, and I have my children, and I, you know, fell in love with a guy and all of that kind of stuff and dated guys. But it was probably about 7 years ago where I said, you know, I can't keep being a counselor and telling my clients to live authentically, and I am not. I can't keep telling them to show up in the world the way that they should, and I'm hiding this part of myself, right? And by that point, I had been already considered what we call successful, right? Like I had my degrees and I owned my home and my children were doing great and we were traveling and doing all that stuff, but I was not being fully authentic. So one day I said, I'm gonna do this. And I went to my kids and I said, hey, this is the situation. My kids right now are 13 and 16. So years ago, they were much smaller. And my daughter was upset with me because she said I held a secret from her for so long and we were not supposed to have secrets in our house. So she got on me about that. And then my son was just like, you know, it's okay as long as you're a cheerleader, as long as whoever you date is your cheerleader. So we've kind of moved past that. But in the meantime, there's been all these different experiences that have come up, right? Because I look the way that I do, people don't necessarily assume that I'm part of the LGBTQ community. I have what we call passing privilege. So people will interact with me as if they perceive me as straight, and they may say something that's inappropriate or do something that's inappropriate, and then I have to check them, which means that I come out as a person who's passing, I come out far more frequently than my wife does. My wife is more masculine presenting. And so when people see her, they automatically assume that she's a lesbian. And so there's certain things that they're going to censor themselves and filter around her, but not necessarily around me, right? And I've taken that into consideration. I've taken into consideration that my parents had to make some adjustments around around how they saw me and what their dreams for me were, right? Like they still were hoping that I would have this beautiful big wedding married to this man. And I had a big, beautiful wedding married to a woman, and they had to make some adjustments around that, right? I had to make my job, who I was working with at the time, they had to also make some adjustments, although they were very supportive. You know, people have a perception about one, and they have perceptions about me, and I had to be patient while people adjusted to all of that, right? But it's hard to be patient when you're living the experience. It's hard to be patient when people are not necessarily nice with you in that regard. So what became my motivation also became my motivation being authentic with my clients and be authentic with myself, because that's what I was requiring of my clients. I also then was doing something that I didn't realize at the time, but I was kind of collecting some of this anecdotal data around what my experience was. And if I was having these experiences as a person who was seen as successful, what were the other experiences that people were having? What were young people's experiences when they were still dependent on their family? What were young people's experiences when their teachers and their professors may have perceptions about them? What were their experiences of themselves when there's fear around civil rights being taken away, you know, depending on who's in charge of that particular state or that country or whatever the case may be. So what ended up happening is I started talking about it more. Once I was fully ready to, once I fully came out, I started marketing that, you know, a client, I am a clinician that is a member of the LGBTQ community. That opened a lot of doors in some regard, because clients were looking for someone that they could relate to, where they didn't have to explain certain things. They didn't have to explain the trauma that came with some of their coming out experiences, or the trauma that comes with, you know, that internal fear of, am I going to be exposed in this moment, right? Is somebody going to out me before I can say something? Or even right now, this is a sensitive time of the year for members of the LGBTQ community, because Thanksgiving and Christmas is when a lot of people reunite with their family. But if your family haven't accepted you, or you haven't come out to your family, it sometimes feels like you're in a prison. And so because I lived those experiences, it made me, it put me in a better position to advocate for that. So what I do, I think your question was around how do I do outreach around that? Well, because I'm open about it, and some of my clinicians are also open about it, I never out them. I let them have the opportunity to identify how they want to identify, but they usually tell me that it's their job to say if they want to say to anybody else. But we do a lot of work in the community. So we're showing up at different events and we're saying, hey, there's actually lesbian counselors out here. There's actually gay counselors out here. There's actually trans counselors that are out here. There's things that you don't have to explain to us because we know it intimately as well. I do articles. When I do a lot of media, I focus that media work around the LGBTQ community. So I'm often in the magazines that we have, like Tag Magazine and Out and things like that, where I'm doing interviews with them and showing up for them. Any of the LGBTQ podcasts, I show up there as well. And I say, hey, you know, we're here, we're doing this work. These are our experiences. And not only is this our identity, but we're actually able to make that identity, we're actually able to use that identity as a catalyst to support you during your times, right? And then one of my other elements within working with LGBTQ communities, I also have a specialization in same-sex couples. So my work around marriage and family therapy and my experiences in the LGBTQ community made a perfect intersection for working with same-sex couples, which have their own traditional couple issues, right? Like communication and, you know, money management and intimacy, some of the same things that heterosexual couples have. But then there's other dynamics that we have to consider, like whether one is out or if they're not out, whether one is comfortable, if they're not comfortable, if people are, if they're using their identity as gay or lesbian or bi as a transition to transitioning, right? Like some people just call themselves a lesbian, but really what their ultimate goal is to transition to the gender that makes sense for them. And if you get in a relationship during that transition and you don't articulate it, then it causes issues in the relationship, right? So helping folks to identify that. And then, yes, just being out in the community. Sometimes I'm out and people will just walk up to me like, hey, Dr. Plummer, I saw your podcast on such and such, and it really helped me, you know, to feel seen and heard and connected. And that's what some of the outreach looks like. And then, of course, the financial contributions as a company to other companies that are supporting the members as well. Did that answer your question? Okay, perfect. Thank you. What are some other thoughts that you may have?
I'm wondering about sort of traditional graduate programs that may not teach the specific sets of skills that you've been able to cultivate over time. And as you think back to a lot of those who are on here are first and second year graduate students, so kind of thinking through, are there particular sets of skills or courses or things that you wish you had had in graduate school to help us sort of think through what that future look like?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question, Mimi. It's one that I'm consistently and constantly having at Hopkins, right? Because they decided that they wanted Dr. Plummer to be part of their faculty. So I say, y'all gonna get the full Dr. Plummer, right? Y'all gonna get all of this that I have to offer you. And so what I do is take my experiences and I do course development, right? So we are about to introduce a course called Counseling Members of the LGBTQ Community. And that's something that we can offer. I am I think there's only two of us on our faculty that are entrepreneurs. So I created the course on entrepreneurship, and I did it versus my colleague because my company is a lot larger, so I can talk about it from a lot of different angles and perspectives. But I do wish that the multicultural course was more broad. I do believe that the multicultural course that's offered right now through most universities, as representative in the KCREP standards or some of our mental health standards, is very limiting. I think that it's full of assumptions and generalizations, and that works when you're trying to challenge things, but it doesn't make people feel emotionally connected to the content. And so when we talk about biases and we talk about transference or countertransference, it's difficult to get students to really understand what that looks like until they get into their practicum or internship sites. So I would love for that course to be offered simultaneously while folks are in practicum or internship, and to be designed to have a lot more guest speakers in there. So you're hearing from people in the LGBTQ community. You're hearing from Latinos as you're trying to counsel them. You're hearing from folks in the Asian population as you're trying to counsel them, understanding that that one person can't be a representation of their whole community, but it feels a little different hearing it from them than to just reading a book and hearing it from your teacher, right, from your professor. So I do wish that there were more courses that were representative of what we're experiencing in the field. That's where I talked a little bit to, I guess, both David and Cantu about the intersection between research and clinical. There's things that can sometimes get lost. Because researchers, again, are looking at their specific data population, and clinicians are doing the work. And if they're not working together, then there's information that gets lost. So I wish the courses were redesigned to reflect what's happening. I also wish that the multicultural course talked about, or that there was a course specifically designed around socialization and elements of socialization that includes politics. We sometimes forget how much politics plays a role in mental health. We always get a spike in our clients around election season because there's the fear of the unknown, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with any political affiliation or party. It has to do with the understanding that a shift may be occurring soon, and what does that look like? And then politics also plays a role in things like economics, which has a role in mental health, or politics play a role in healthcare, or politics plays a role in, where one can actually live, right? Because if people can't get a job in their state and they have to relocate, they're now considered transplants. They're away from their family, all of that kind of stuff. It has implications on politics. But right now, mental health steers away from talking about politics because it causes people to feel uncomfortable. But as mental health people, our job is to sometimes talk about what is uncomfortable, right? Because otherwise clients are holding that in and they're internalizing it and still don't have anybody to talk to about it. So I wish that there were more courses that were reflective of what we're actually seeing in the field, like working with same-sex couples or working with members of the LGBT, how politics affects mental health, how economics or socialization affects mental health. Instead, we just get the basics. What that, of course, would require is that our counseling programs are a little bit longer, right? Like maybe we add on an extra semester to talk about some of these things, or we add on some extra electives. But I think it would actually make better counselors. Yeah, better mental health folks. I keep using the word counselor, but I mean it to be synonymous with all mental health. I just say counselor, but we all doing similar things.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mimi. That was a wonderful question too. Thank you. What other questions may you have?
Dr. Plummer, thanks for all your insights. I think some of our early clinicians and all of us are may be looking for some advice about handling some of these challenging conversations about political issues with clients. And what are some of your recommendations for doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some great research done by Hernandez. Oh, what is her first name? I think I could send some of these resources to you, Dr. G, and then you could get them out, Dr. G and Sarah, and you could give them out to your students as well. But Dr. Hernandez did some research around how to engage in difficult conversations in the clinical setting. So first, there's already research and books about how to engage in difficult conversations. So identifying the problem, understanding the emotions that are connected there, coming up with solutions. And then implementing the solution. There's also processes and structures around the communication process. So one person speaks, the other person summarizes to ensure that there's no filters that are in place. And then the other person clarifies or confirms, and then it goes kind of back and forth. So what I do in my sessions when I'm about to have or engage in a difficult conversation is that I use one of those two-step processes. I'm either using the problem-solving process or the communication process because it gives me structure in terms of how to navigate the conversations. And it also, but even before that, I check to see where I am around certain things because I know that I am a person too. And although I have 16 years of clinical experience, there's elements of which I can still be triggered, right? And so if I had a client who came in with a political affiliation that was very different than mine, and they were very adamant about what was right and what was wrong, I know that that could be a trigger for myself. So I've already acknowledged where my where some of my sensitivity is, and ground myself in that I could also be blindsided. So I do things before myself before I go into some of these difficult conversations. I sage my office, I burn my candles, I play some music. I work out almost every day before I see clients because that allows me to like get my energy high. And if I have something that I'm dealing with in my personal life, it allows me to like release that. So some days I'm working out and I'm running because I just need a light run. And some days I'm in there trying to lift all the weight that I can because I need to release some of this adrenaline that's running through my body, right? So I do the things that take care of myself first, and then I go and prepare myself for my clients by planning the session and knowing which of those two structures that I'm going to use. So first, taking care of myself. Second, having a plan in place, and then using that plan to engage in the difficult conversation. There's no question that you all can ask me that would throw me off. I don't filter my questions to my clients because I filter it in the words that I use. But if I feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't ask this question, I definitely ask that question because I believe that in mental health, we are the people who get to ask the questions that nobody else will ask them. And we get to give them the space to process information in a way that nobody else can. And we get to engage with dialogue in a way that other people can't. And that's part of the healing process. Sometimes clients are unhealed because they're not talking. So it's my job to bring that information forward. And that's how I see my work. So again, I take care of myself. I plan out for my sessions. I use a structure that's in place. I also only bring up difficult conversations maybe about 20 minutes into the session. And I talk about it for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I close it out. We never end on a difficult conversation. We don't start on difficult conversations, and we don't end on difficult conversations, primarily because people tend to remember the most how something starts and how something ends. You guys might remember from when you were learning to read, when you first started grad school, and maybe one of your professors said, read all of these articles and make sure you pay attention to what they really say at the top and what they say at the bottom, right? Because that's where you're going to get the summary. That's where you get introduction to summary, and then you highlight what's in the middle. I need my clients to still feel connected with me even after we've had a difficult conversation. So I use what I call the sandwich approach. There's some bread at the top, there's some bread at the bottom, we got the meat right here in the middle. But what you're gonna get is a lot of bread. The meat is flavorful, it got a lot going on with it. That's why you like it, that's why you keep eating it. But the bread is the cushion, right? And so we use the sandwich approach. But because I've been planning, I know what kind of questions I want to ask when it gets to the meat. And I know how I'm going to get us out of the meat. And it's usually because I will say something like, I appreciate you for sharing that with me. I recognize that this is a conversation that you may not talk about with everybody, but you were courageous in engaging this with me. How did it feel to engage in conversation like this? And that's how we kind of transition out of the topic. And sometimes after the session, I have to go and take a break and drink some tea or go for a walk. And that's my way of self-care. So I also am very careful about how I plan out my sessions. And then sometimes it's fine right after the session, but I'm aware of myself because I am a human engaged in a therapeutic relationship. I'm not just an objective person. I am a human engaged in a therapeutic relationship. Did that answer your question, Dr. G?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And now I'm actually getting a little hungry, all the talk about sandwiches.
Okay. And what other questions? I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I so appreciate you all for engaging with me like this as well. Risa?
Yes, hi. Thank you for this. This is wonderful. I have the privilege of working with the students when they first come in a course on motivational interviewing. Mm-hmm. So half of these students are in it now and half had it last year. And I recognize a couple things that you talked about in the beginning that seem to have some similarities in terms of not asking more than 3 questions in a row and just all the listening and that kind of thing. And I think it's a good broad approach. However, I just wonder if you have any suggested modifications or things to think about in implementing some motivational interviewing that has more relevance for multicultural clients and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So when I am deciding to work with different clients, I do a lot of reading. That goes back to, I think, where we were talking about before, Cantu and David. I want to read. I don't ask my clients to fill me in on information that I could easily find myself, right? And so if I'm working with a specific population, I'm reading about that population and not necessarily just from a therapeutic or theoretical model. I may be reading the books that are important to them. So say, for instance, I'm working with Black women. I'm probably going to read a book like Their Eyes Were Watching God, right? By Zora Neale Hurston. Or I'm going to read some Maya Angelou books. Or I'm going to read, maybe they're having relationship issues and I'm going to read something by Langston Hughes or by, James Baldwin, because I don't want to just hear the approach from the client. I want to understand it within context. So when I'm working with same-sex couples, I'm reading a book like Does Your Mama Know, right? Or I'm reading books by Audre Lorde or listening to songs by different artists that are in the community, because I want to emerge into the context a little bit so that when I ask my questions, if I know that I'm limiting myself to like 3 questions in that small segment, and 3 is the most that I ask, I usually try to structure my questions based off of the Bloom's taxonomy, which is a teaching strategy, but you can use that to reframe your questions to go deeper with your clients. And so I get into the culture as much as I can so that when I ask the questions, I'm strategic about which question I'm asking, because again, clients don't want to be interrogated. And if you're asking them questions as if they are supposed to educate you, it takes away from their therapeutic experience, right? Like they don't come to therapy to teach somebody about what it means to be gay. They come to therapy because they're trying to process what their lived experience is around being gay. And so I take more of that onto myself. Is it time consuming? Yes. But what that also means is I don't see more than maybe 4 clients a day, right? Because I'm planning. And my planning includes reading, and it includes watching shows that they may say that they want to watch. And I actually learned part of this from working with kids back in the day, because I would watch the same cartoons they were watching, because they were always making these references to these cartoons and these cartoon characters, which were serving as role models for them. Who is the role model for many adults? It's the things that they're reading, the things that they're seeing. It's the people who've been in their life. So I get engaged in that, so that by the time they're ready to have a counseling session with me, I don't have to ask them a whole lot of questions that gives me context. I'm asking them questions that then help support their learning and their development, their healing process. I also include different types of therapy that helps with the motivational interviewing piece too. So we may do bibliotherapy, where we are both reading the same book. We may do cinema therapy, where I ask them to watch a movie and I watch it too. Or they tell me what they plan to watch this weekend and I watch it too, so that we can have some connections around that. We also do things, we don't always do all of our sessions in the office. Sometimes we may go for a walk, or we may go out and do some nature-based things as well, which makes them feel connected, but it also ensures that I'm just not asking a lot of questions, because we're like doing things together as well. So again, a very non-traditional approach, but I'm also working with clients who have been marginalized. So a traditional approach with people of which the tradition has been the weapon used against them doesn't work. I can't be a part of the system and act in the system that has hurt my clients. I have to sometimes step out of that system so that I can meet them where they are. Did that help?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And if I say doesn't help and things really don't help, I've had people tell me, nope, that didn't help. And so I love that too, because it gives me the opportunity to kind of think about it a new way and follow up. But I know we're going to be getting off of here in just a second. I wanted to be able to see if there were any closing questions beforehand, and then to tell you how to get in contact with me, because whenever I do these talks, I am very much open for people to reach out to me afterwards, because it's such a small amount of time, but you may be thinking about certain things an hour later, or 2 hours later, or a week later, and I want you to be able to get in contact with me as that happens. Okay. Yes, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plummer. Can we all unmute and give Dr. Plummer a round of applause?
Thank you.
That was great.
So thank you. Yes, I think that you offered a lot of wonderful insights and suggestions that will be helpful for students in their clinical work and navigating careers moving forward. So really appreciate it. So next week, only the second years and Dr. Lambert will be attending sessions. So Dr. Lambert will be guiding externship orientation. So faculty and first years do not need to attend. And then all of us will regroup the following week for Matt Balaguer's second year project. So thanks everyone, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Dr. Lambert will see you next week. And please also note that it's a different link for Colloquium next week, so you can access that through the online schedule. All right, bye everyone, thanks.